Hormones are incredibly powerful molecules. So for any doctor to be dosing hormones and never checking blood labs, it's my opinion, malpractice, or negligence at the very least. But you got to be talking, the provider has to be talking to the woman. How do you feel? Right? How do you feel, Zora, on your day 12? Is your sleep disrupted? Is it too much? Is it too low? Could you go a little higher? Should you be lower? So, your dosing regimen is going to be this sort of nice building peak, and then there's a taper down, and then there's maybe a slight bump. You're mimicking essentially if you pulled up a graph of the menstrual cycle and looked at our hormone output. So the dosing tracks that. So if you're really worried about high amounts, you're really just looking at that day 12 peak.
All right. Well, it's a real pleasure to have again for part 2, Maria Claps and Kristin Johnson. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
We got to figure out where we picked up, where we last, dropped off. So anyone who's listening now, you can go, I'll have the show in the show notes, the replay of part 1, but let's get to part 2. And we're talking about, most of the time when I created these questions, it was talking about the Great Menopause Myth, as the book that you girls have wrote, and I thought it was absolutely fabulous. It's like my Bible now for menopause. I go to that whenever I have any doubts or questions. Loved it. So you mentioned in the book that there was a synthetic estrogen called Enovid that came out in the 1960s. And it was something about, it was an experiment on Puerto Rican women. And you said, quote unquote, no studies were done on the safety or effectiveness of synthetic estrogen. And I find this mind blowing. I didn't know this. And, really, how come most of us, including doctors, are just not aware of it?
Well, I mean, Maria, what's that book that you've read on? Essentially, it's medical apartheid, right?
Yes, that's the name of it. Yeah, it's stunning.
We bring drugs to market to see if they accomplish what they were seeking to accomplish, which in this instance was to cease ovulation. So it met that goal, and therefore it was brought to market. There was no safety efficacy, there was no follow-up, there was no long-term studies, nothing. And some of these women were given it unknowingly. So it's a horrific history when you get into synthetic estrogen's origins and initial market development.
Mind blowing. I mean, that's just so wrong. So wrong. But we are evolving, right? Tell me yes.
I don't know. Last couple of years, there's been some drugs that have been a little concerning with no testing, but
yes. Well, or testing only on men, or testing on non-menopausal women. Of course, that's, they're very few.
Or in the case of the WHI, testing on women that are 10 plus years past menopause.
Yeah.
Already sick. And
it's crazy. It's so crazy. So in the book as well, I found out you talked a lot about, and you do in your social media as well, talk a lot about physiological levels of hormones. And this is a controversial topic too. Some people say it's too much. Other people say we're always going so low. Why do we need to get physiological levels of hormones? Maybe explain, what is physiological anyways?
Physiologic really refers to the hormones that a woman has and levels that she has when she is young and healthy. Right? We don't see a 25 or a 30-year-old coming down with osteoporosis or heart disease or dementia. So that's what we're referring to, those levels. And then why do women need them? Well, I'm going to start with this, and that is they feel better. They feel a lot better, right? They don't typically, I know maybe the case is a little different for you, and I'm not saying this is only related to hormones, but they don't have joint pain, right? They don't have hot flashes. And Kristin and I will speak to so many women who are on HRT. They'll get a diagnosis of osteoporosis, and they'll be like, why? I've been on the patch. I've been on the, 0.0375 patch for 10 years or what have you. And why do I have osteoporosis? And I've done everything right. So
yeah, I mean, if we talk about, even the premise of the book is saying that our hormones were regulating multiple biologic processes around the woman's body our entire lives, from puberty onwards, once we had these robust amounts of hormones. So our position is, if we know, which we do know, that as we lose these hormones, we essentially lose the stimulation needed for those biological processes. This leads to disease states for women. Why is that okay? Why is it okay to deprive women of the levels of hormones that would prevent reaching those disease states due to a lack of hormones, right? So that's the issue is we have physiologic levels. It's not just, oh, it's the level that a 30-year-old had. It's the level that was making sure that 30-year-old didn't get osteoporosis and heart disease, like Maria said. So why is it okay to not give a woman those same levels as she gets through menopause? And it's based in this whole, well, you only need enough to essentially stop your symptoms, meaning stop you complaining, right? That's what they mean. And even the WHI understood that the medical system recognized replacing women's hormones as a means of disease prevention. This goes all the way back to the early 1900s. Every medical society recognized it, et cetera. Now, the problem was obviously with the WHI is when they decided to test this theory finally and say, do we know for sure? Do we really get these hormones to prevent disease? They, A, didn't actually use hormones. They used synthetic drugs. And B, they worked on women who already had disease. So that's why that was a colossal failure. But if we just look at what it has always been well accepted, that if you were 29 and you had no cycle, even if you went to the doctor and said, it's okay, I'm not interested in having kids, I don't need my menstrual cycle to return, that doctor would still say, no, 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 we're going to put a patch on you or some cream or even give you oral estradiol because your bones are at risk. So that argument is used when women are younger, and yet it is completely ignored and in fact dismissed when people are older. That's a load of crap.
Absolutely. And well, I guess that makes us even confirms even more. Yeah, I guess now that we're not fertile, now that we're useless to society, well, let's just let her die or just who cares?
Yeah.
It's so dismissive. When I read that chapter in your book, I was like, oh my gosh, you're absolutely right. I've never thought of that. And you're right. It's why is it okay for a younger woman? Why
Right.
would you give her physiological levels and not protect the older woman? Well, that's hopefully has to change.
Well, and it even goes to the manner of delivering hormone replacement therapy to women is very much scoffed at when it's suggested that you mimic the manner that those hormones were produced when we were younger. We've got a very prominent male OBGYN on the social spheres who will literally just crap all over this and say, women don't need their menstrual cycle back. Okay, no one's saying we're doing it to get the menstrual cycle back. What we're doing is to get the stimulatory responses and catalyst triggers in the body because that's what they were doing all along. And that's kind of the fundamental, I think, misunderstanding about menopause is that it's captured as it's just this loss of the menstrual cycle. It's like, no, the menstrual cycle was just one thing that was involved in the whole rhythmic dance of hormones. What was really going on was keeping the female body healthy.
So then what our physiological levels look like in terms of range? So we're not talking about how much of a dosage you should be taking.
Right.
Right.
We know that
Right.
every woman is absorbing differently. So
Right.
what are you looking at, for example, in estradiol? What's the range that you recommend to get a woman in to protect her bones?
I think we have to almost stay away from ranges because we don't know what, Zora's day 12 peak was of estradiol when you were 30 versus Kristin's versus Maria's. What we do know for sure is that the lowest level of estradiol tends to be in the second half of the luteal phase of a woman's cycle, right? That's when estrogen's on its decline, right before they get a menstrual period. What's the average level? In that luteal phase, it's about 125 to 150 picograms per ml. And I know you've got a lot of international listeners, but I don't have the international conversion in my head.
Yeah,
okay.
in Europe, we use picograms.
Okay, so
I
yeah,
mean, we do have lower levels in the first few days, but just generally, those are very low, and women don't feel well.
Yeah,
right. When you're bleeding.
Yeah, and that's when you're premenopausal, when you're fertile, or this is
correct.
Yeah.
We're talking about the cycle.
Yeah. So if you could accept that at about 125 to 150, below that, the wheels start to come off. Okay. This is when you're going to have physiologic changes, biological processes are going to be disrupted and interrupted, et cetera, et cetera. That's whether you're premenopausal or postmenopausal on HRT. So we would posit that that's about a baseline, that a minimum that you would want to be at. Now, whether or not a woman wants to go up and down during her cycle, just the way estradiol naturally went up and down, that's a whole nother discussion. So if you look at a day 12 peak, you're talking anywhere from 300 to 500 or higher picograms per ml. Now that's only on a day, right? So you're not dosing that every day, and we're not suggesting you're dosing that every day. But if you were to try and mimic that cycle, that rhythm that of output that occurred premenopausally, you would kind of have this baseline around the 125, 150, and then you'd bump up at a certain point in the cycle or come down. For those women who do static, same dose every single day, we would take the position that below 125 or so, you're at risk. That you will not have the same robust bone remodeling. You might prevent your already established osteoporosis from getting worse, but you're not going to recover that bone. You can recover it at higher levels because we start to stimulate the osteoclasts and osteoblasts.
You're working with a lot of women in your community, and you're looking at a lot of blood work. And so when do you see a woman where she's too high? You go, okay, well, wait a second. That's what number is that?
500 to 800, sometimes 1,000.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, some women feel good at 500, but again, only a couple days, right? They're not there the whole time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you're at the 300s every single day, that's probably going to be problematic because that's kind of a proliferative state. But, you can get receptor overwhelm where you get such a high level, whether it's persistent or over a couple days, that your receptors sort of shut down. It's a protective measure to be like, that's a little much for me. And so women will feel low estradiol during that time, even though they might have blood lab levels of like 1,000. Right. And so that's just an overwhelmed situation.
Mm-hmm. So then a woman who's doing the rhythmic cycle, let's say of estradiol, because we hear, the progesterone, it's quite common for women to go on days 14 to 28 of their cycle or mimic that cycle if they're not cycling. But it's less known about cycling estrogen. So,
don't
hold
cycle
on
it.
1 second. Totally. We totally get why you want to say cycling. We don't cycle estrogen.
You're not cycling estrogen. It sounded like that's
what you're referring to is using it rhythmically.
Yeah.
So cycling is on off, and you never take a day off of estradiol. So that's why we don't use cycling with respect to estradiol, but on off progesterone, we cycle it. So yeah, it's a rhythmic.
I meant to say rhythmic. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, and a day 12 rhythmic, if you're, using Physiologic, a day 12 rhythmic could be 350 to 550. But again, it depends on where a woman feels best. I mean, I, at a level of 200 and lower, when I go below 200, I get migraines. My knees feel like they are bone on bone and I'm going to die. And I literally, I want to just peace out on this earth.
Yeah.
That's just me. Some women are great at, say, 125, 150. But for me, it's more 200 is kind of my lower tolerance. So every woman's different.
So, but then how are you measuring what they're getting on because you have to do it for how many days, testing for how many days to figure out actually how much are they absorbing during this?
You check on your day 12 peak and you check on your day 21, which would be your peak of progesterone.
But what about all the time in between, especially if you're
you don't necessarily need to know every single day, and that would be kind of unwieldy at that point. But so when you test progesterone on day 21, you can also run estradiol, and again, about 125 to maybe 250 would be where we would want to see that.
Yeah, you're not dosing the same amount every day. Like day 12 is your peak dose if you're doing physiologic restoration. So, a day 12 peak dose, you check your level on that day. But the other thing too is labs aren't the end all be all. And we are totally against NAM's position that women don't need to have labs drawn. That is an absolute load of crap and shame on them. Hormones are incredibly powerful molecules. So for any doctor to be dosing hormones and never checking blood labs, it's, my opinion, malpractice, or negligence at the very least. But you got to be talking, the provider has to be talking to the woman. How do you feel? Right? How do you feel, Zora, on your day 12? Is your sleep disrupted? Is it too much? Is it too low? Could you go a little higher? Should you be lower? So, your dosing regimen is going to be this sort of nice building peak, and then there's a taper down, and then there's maybe a slight bump. You're mimicking essentially if you pulled up a graph of the menstrual cycle and looked at our hormone output. So the dosing tracks that. So if you're really worried about high amounts, you're really just looking at that day 12 peak.
Mm. So then you would take the women that you're working with in your community. I should probably really just get in there and see what you're doing. like these questions, but you're probably getting an idea of asking them about their symptoms. And then you are tracking, okay, let's test on this day and that day, and let's see how you're feeling. And then if they coincide, then you can probably get a good idea where perhaps they are. It's no guarantees. There are no guarantees in life for anything, but it's probably a good guess. And they're probably
There's another marker though too that Marie and I talk about in the book called FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and that's a brain hormone. I think a lot of women think it's a sex hormone. It's a brain hormone, but it's another tool that many skilled providers use to essentially say, okay, even if Zora thinks she's feeling good and her labs are kind of a little off, let's look at what that FSH is. Well, if the FSH is say like 26, that's your brain saying, I would like more. Why do I need more? Because I am the great orchestrator of all these endocrine functions and all these other physiologic processes. So that is another tool that doctors can say, okay, labs of estradiol and progesterone, how Zora feels, and then what does the brain have to say about all of this? And you overlay all those together and you get a very clear picture for how a woman is doing.
Do you know Dr. Lindsay Berkson, right?
Yep.
Yes.
She mentioned, I remember, I don't know where I heard her say this, that FSH, she likes it to be under 25 to protect the brain better. Like, I think she's a 5, something
5.
quite low.
Yeah. 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 We agree.
Yeah.
Yes, we do. We think under 5 is great.
So if
We're like a step down approach. Like, let's get you under 25 first. So let's aim for under 10. And then if we can get under 5, great.
Yeah. So if you are concerned about your brain, FSH is the one to test. And it's really, all these markers are really great. And also, I guess if you are concerned about the bones, well, then you take your DEXA or your REM scan and see your density and strength and go from there too. It's not
look at your lipids, look at your liver, like look at your inflammation markers, look at your thyroid. I mean, if we are not looking under the hood and yet we're going to be tinkering under the hood with hormones, that's kind of, a mistaken approach.
The whole rhythmic idea is something I think a lot of women in my community are asking about and they want to know more about. And so perhaps we should do a whole other episode on that. But I'm wondering if there's anyone like me. Last night, I woke up and I was feeling a little hot and I was like, oh, and then I was like, I forgot to put on my estrogen, my estradiol. And I thought, I was sitting there going, should I get up and put it in now, or should I just wait it out? Like, how long will it take to kick in? What would you advise somebody who's
Put it on
like that?
Put it on.
Put it on.
Go and put it on.
And depending, if you were supposed to be doing your next dose, let's say you woke up at 3 a.m. and felt that way, but your normal dosing time would be 6 a.m. Okay, so maybe you only put on a little bit, half your dose or something, but do not white knuckle it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which also, Zora, goes to the pharmacokinetics of cream. It really is gone after 12 hours. So if it's not at all surprising that, you had some symptoms from not applying it.
Yeah, that's what I was so wondering. It's like, okay, if I put it on, then do I put it on at the normal time? And then I was like, oh, these are the questions that you guys are so good at answering. And so, yeah, thank you. I think, I didn't even think of just taking a tiny bit more. I mean, tiny bit less than I already do and just get back on it. So wonderful. I learned so much from you girls. You're amazing. So let's talk about progesterone. And Carol Peterson, who you know as well, she's like the progesterone queen. And she is a compounding pharmacist. And I've done a couple of podcasts with her. And in our last interview, I challenged her about women who are very sensitive to progesterone. And when they increase the dosages, they just get worse and worse and depressed and more depressed. And I understand that there are women, I've met them, I've talked to them who say they need very high dosages of progesterone. It's like they say, it saved my life. Carol Peterson, I think she said the highest she's ever gone, I don't think this is something she does regularly, is 2,800 milligrams. And we normally take 100 milligrams is like the general dosage most people start with. And then of course, you gotta test as well to see if you're absorbing this, but it seems as though I didn't have the chance to ask her, but it's like as if she was saying the progesterone receptors are immune to saturation. Like, I don't know why, if the other receptors that we have are not immune, why progesterone is. So what are your thoughts on this little discussion we had?
Well, let me just ask first, do you happen to know she, in the podcast that you did with her, did you talk about estradiol at all?
Yes, yes, yes. To get them in balance, because that was one of my questions. Was it just about increasing progesterone, or do we just need it in balance with estradiol?
Did she talk about having enough estradiol to create receptors for progesterone?
I don't remember, to be honest.
That's okay.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think that's what Marie's getting. There's two different scenarios that are being talked about when we hear women who have intolerance to progesterone. And I think we always have to kind of like pump the brakes a little bit and say, well, first of all, what levels of estradiol do you even have? Because what women don't understand is that estradiol is needed to build the progesterone receptor every month. Okay. Then are you taking it cyclically or every day? These are really important questions to understand before addressing a woman's so-called intolerance to it. Can women be intolerant? Yes. But yes, only after you've actually cured for those other two things, meaning getting your estradiol levels up enough to have the receptors to receive progesterone and cycling the progesterone, because it's the body's not used to seeing it every single day, every single day, every single day, right? So we don't want to gaslight those women who have sufficient levels of estradiol, meaning they have good progesterone receptors and they're taking it cyclically and they still have an intolerance to it. That is real. That does happen to some people. Is it as common as a lot of women want to say? No. When they have this gross intolerance to it, it's often because they have almost no receptors built up because their estradiol levels, they're getting it off of like a 0.025 patch. So if you have a tiny dose of estradiol that stopped your hot flash, that doesn't mean it's sufficient enough to build the receptor for progesterone. Then you pour a bunch of progesterone in the tank and you're going to get sore boobs and water weight and breast tenderness and anxiety and mood swings and sleep issues and all these other things that all the progesterone acolytes are screaming, it solves everything. And Maria and I are like, I don't know if it solves everything.
It sounds like a miracle when you talk to her. It's like,
Yeah.
I just get my back of my mind thinking it can't be all about progesterone. Come on. Yeah. So thank you. I was wondering like, why is that? So then let's actually explain a little bit about the hormones and the hormone receptors and why they're so important. Your book covered this really, really well. So let's give a little taste of what is a hormone and a hormone receptor.
So receptors just receive the signal from the actual hormones that kind of go throughout the bloodstream. Receptors are on every organ and cell in the body. So, if those receptors are not there, they will start to, we don't know if we lose them, they flatten, they change in shape, but without the estrogen in the system, those receptors, they either flatten or they just go away. I'm sure it's different in different areas of the body. But that's why, that's why as much as I want like my 76-year-old mom to sleep a little better, and I'm like tempted to say, Mom, progesterone, just ask your doctor, get, a 10-day supply, give it a try. I'm like tempted, but I'm like, I know she probably doesn't have much estrogen, estradiol that is, and I'm wary of getting her hopes up for progesterone. And another thing people don't realize is, again, Kristin, pretty much said it, and that is estradiol, not progesterone. Estradiol creates that progesterone receptor. This beautiful kind of dance between the two hormones. And I believe, Kristin, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe what creates the estradiol receptor is the concentration of estradiol in the blood.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So this is why you need adequate exposure to estradiol over your lifetime in order to maintain receptor viability for estradiol. And then, when we talk about this rhythmic thing, it's actually not just the presence of estradiol, but a sufficient amount of estradiol plus some sort of a peak is what triggers the progesterone receptor recruitment. So that's really important because a lot of these women who are on static dosing, it's usually A, too low, and B, it's this persistent level state. They're just not going to get that recruitment of the progesterone receptor. And so it doesn't feel great when they take progesterone. And we get that, but there's a solution to that. And that's changing your HRT regimen so that you actually have viable receptors.
You mentioned earlier that when the body doesn't recognize, or it's not recognized, it's just not used to static doses of progesterone. Yeah. And that's why you like the cycling of it on and off. But what about those women who swear by it? Like they just feel so good when they're on it every day and they don't really want to let it go.
A lot.
Yeah, I think we might have different things to say. We are never going to put down someone's lived in body experience. If, who am I to say, no, you don't feel good, you could feel better, right? I'm not going to say that. But the only thing the immediate first question I have for them is, well, how long has this been going on? Are you new to HRT? Have you been doing it for 6 months, a year? Like, if you tell me that at year 5, or maybe even more challenging, year 10, that you still feel great, like, I'll eat humble pie. Okay. Just because it's kind of the same thing with pellets. Is like, I'll speak to people, oh, I just started pellets and it's been like, I've had like 2 insertions and I feel great. I'm like, great. That's great. You're having newbie wins. You're getting like initial benefits, but we suspect, we don't have anything to prove it, we suspect that you don't stimulate those receptors properly, that eventually it's going to happen. I mean, we have tons of anecdotal experience with clients who, like, they listen to us, they go through an education process, they'll hear all about this, they'll get really in detailed coaching on it, and they choose a patch and static daily, nightly oral progesterone, which is okay, right? Is we're not putting it down. People can do it. It is a strategy. And we're not going to put anyone down for doing that. But then they'll come back 6 months, sometimes years later, breakthrough bleeding, or hot flashes, or just not.
Osteoporosis.
What's that?
Osteoporosis. That's
Oh,
usually the
yeah.
big thing. Yeah.
And then they're willing to change.
Yeah.
So again, my first question is, how long?
Progesterone also has 2 features. One, it can stimulate GABA. For some, it can overstimulate some GABA stuff, and that's a problem for some women. It can drive anxiety and things like that. But for those that don't have great GABA situation, progesterone metabolites help escort GABA across the blood-brain barrier. And so it can be perceived as sort of calming an internal storm for some women. But one of the biggest features about progesterone is its sedating effect. And most women who are taking it every single day are popping a pill at night. Nothing wrong with oral progesterone, by the way. I think a lot of women get freaked out when we're like, don't take estrogen orally. They're like, what about my progesterone? Totally fine. But let's be honest that when we are sleep deprived, we feel like utter hell. And when we're sleep deprived, we also don't make good decisions and other bodily processes stop. And we can really have health effects, negative health effects from bad sleep. So if you take a woman who's really suffered from sleep declines, and then you give her progesterone, and usually it's an increasing dose of progesterone, by the way, those women who love it, what you're doing is essentially drugging her at night. She's getting sleep, and thus she feels better during the day. So we have to be honest about that, because what you'll start to see is women who are like, it doesn't work when I'm off it, if they cycle it. So you had said static progesterone. I think you meant continuous, right? So we're not fans of the continuous because A, that's not what the body saw. It doesn't have the same impact on the receptor handoff with estradiol. It doesn't have the same triggering of everything from certain cells within our vascular tissues, our bones. I mean, progesterone does things outside of the uterus. Still, some doctors don't believe that, but newsflash, you're wrong. So the issue with progesterone constantly, and then people saying, but when I cycle it, I don't sleep well. Maria and I always say, do you have trouble falling asleep? Well, no, I wake up all night. Well, newsflash, ladies, estradiol is what keeps you asleep. Progesterone only initiates sleep. And so again, it's probably because your estradiol dose is too low. That's why you love being sedated every single night with progesterone. So this conversation again goes back to, what is your regimen? What's your dosing? And what are your levels? Because if you love your progesterone so much, it's probably because of the sleep inducing effects. And that's going to be diminishing returns. And ultimately, if you're waking up in the middle of the night when you're not taking progesterone, it's because your estrogen's too low. Or, blood sugar issues. We could go into metabolic issues. But from a hormonal standpoint, that's what's at play.
What do you think about Dr. Felice Gersh? Because you and I, we all run around the same circles in the sense that and she mentioned on a podcast I had with her that I was surprised. It was the first time I heard of it, was having too low levels of estradiol is actually inflammatory, and having them at higher dosages, physiological dosages, are anti-inflammatory. Are we just putting ourselves at risk? I mean, we better off not taking hormones rather than very low
Well,
dosages?
I think Felice would probably agree with us. We agree with each other. And that's saying that some is better than none, because at least with some, you may get some quality of life improvement, right? And that is not to, we don't shake a stick at that. That matters as well. But, well, when women are part of the problem of aging is low hormones. And what is low hormones? It's menopause is a state of default inflammation in the body. And large in part that is due to just having essentially no estradiol.
Yeah. I mean, I think what Felice was saying is physiologic levels are better because they are anti-inflammatory. What Maria's saying is without any hormones, it is a pro-inflammatory state. I think what Felice is saying is with respect to low doses of hormones, it's not that they induce inflammation. They're just not going to resolve the inflammation that's present because of the low hormone state that you started in because of menopause.
Well,
So
and good point. And also it kind of maintains.
yes.
So this is what we
Yeah.
always say, put on like a low dose patch, as a lot of women start with. And again, you may get some quality of life improvement, and that's great. But you are actually, if you were to test, and unfortunately, like Kristin said, so many doctors don't, you might find that you went from an under 5 pg per ml on estradiol to 30. You're as that, so it on pretty much any lab test up to about 55 is still considered a postmenopausal range. So you're putting on a patch, you're technically, like, we want to move you out of menopause. We're not moving you out of menopause. You are postmenopausal if you
We're
are.
going to move you out of a hormone deficiency.
Yeah, we want to move you out of a hormone deficiency. And so you put that patch on, you go from 5 to 30. Yeah, the inflammatory processes that are going on simply because you're a postmenopausal woman are probably still going on.
Yeah. Yeah. So you need the higher levels to resolve inflammation or to prevent it from starting at all if you're the lucky ones who start HRT and peri. Yeah.
Actually, you have a bigger community and seeing a lot of women for many, many years. Dr. Felice Gersh when she gets these physiological levels, she's really seeking to initiate bleeding again. Are you seeing that as well in your community with a lot of women you're looking to get their periods back?
Well, we are that, but that is just an artifact of what we're doing. It's not the goal or the point. I mean, it's a biomarker, but it's not like, oh, here we got to get the period back. Like that's the pedestal, that's the goal. No, the goal is to get all the benefits back of the cycled progesterone and the rhythmic estradiol.
Yeah.
And those benefits are anti-cancer and, good for bones and good for brain and good for skin. But getting the period back is it just kind of comes along for the ride.
Yeah. It's just anytime you withdraw progesterone, right, from a woman's cycle, whether it's on the birth control pill or natural cycles or HRT, anytime you start it and stop it with estrogen always present, you're going to have a bleed. But, the problem is that doctors don't want to manage you ladies if you're bleeding. The problem is that the conventional wisdom says that a postmenopausal woman bleeding is cancer. And now we're going to subject her to a DNC or, some sort of procedure and scare the hell out of her and everything else. The reality is that even women on continuous progesterone are at risk of having breakthrough unmanaged bleeding. That's scary, right? Because it wasn't expected. When you cycle your progesterone, a bleed is expected. Not like Maria said, it's not the goal, but it's expected as an outcome of cycling progesterone. And so we make a very, I think, good point in the book is that the menstrual cycle is a vital sign. When we were, let's say, in our 20s, if you're bleeding horrifically and you're dropping clots and you have horrible cramping and everything else, that's a sign that something is amiss. It's probably metabolic, maybe it's liver, whatever, but we have to go address that. So really good HRT doctors who cycle progesterone show that they can manage that bleed as a sign as to, are you too high, too low, etc. How are things going? It's just yet again another layer of that. Zora's symptoms, Zora's estradiol labs, Zora's FSH, and then again this bleed. That bleed tells a well-skilled doctor so much information about what's going on in your body. But the reality is doctors, particularly that particular male doctor that we just referenced on social media, he doesn't want to deal with your bleed. They don't want to deal with it. And these femtech platforms, they want to have a 10-minute conversation that they're going to charge you $150 for and rewrite your script and see you in another quarter. That's not administering medicine. It's just not.
I always tell women, well, when they say, well, I'm going to go on HRT, what do you think my lab should be? And I said, well, I don't know. What is your objective? Is your objective just to get rid of the symptoms, which is totally a choice? Like it's
Right.
my body. Or is your objective to alleviate the symptoms and take care of your future self? So when you're in your 70s or 80s. So it's totally a choice, and no judgment here. It's just, I think if that's your objective, to get just the symptoms done and not think about your future self, well, yeah, fine. Go get your, minimum dosage just to feel better. But
Yeah.
Eventually, I think especially when you reach that older age, you go, oh, well, wait a second. Like, yeah, now I'm worried about my bones, or no, my brain's starting to go.
That's what it takes. I mean, my neighbor just sadly was in a very bad car accident and broke some bones. And then they look at it and they're like, oh my gosh, things are so bad. And it's like, well, you're 62 and chose not to do hormones. And I always giggle because you just said when women say, I want to do HRT, Marie and I go, well, what is HRT to you? Because that's a whole nother discussion. Before you even get to the whole, what are my goals? What do you even understand HRT to be? Because you're still going to find doctors who are going to give a Mirena IUD or a birth control pill or vaginal estradiol and tell you that you're on HRT. So you better know what HRT is and what it is that you're seeking in addition to your goals.
Super important. Out of the women who are in your community who are on these physiological levels, do all of them have a bleed?
Well, if they have a uterus, they are cycling progesterone, and this often gets left out of the conversation. They are using enough estradiol to build up the lining of the uterus, then yes, they will eventually have a bleed. Even if it doesn't happen, it may not happen like the first cycle, the second cycle, but it will happen.
Yeah. And it's a great point because Marie and I will have women say, I started cycling my progesterone, but I'm not bleeding. And then you find out they're on the 0.025 patch and they still have 30 picograms per ml as their, level. That's not going to be enough to monthly shed a lining of the uterus. It's just not going to build up enough.
How do they know if they should go to the doctor and it's just a cycle and it's fine, it's just a side effect of the physiological levels, or if they need to actually go see the doctor, it's something else?
Well, I mean, the doctor should be telling them, expect it during these days. It should not be painful. There should not be PMS. Like anyone listening might be like me who had horrific menstrual cycles in my 20s. And they're going, Kristin and Maria, you are nuts. There is no way I'm bringing that back. That's not what this bleed is. It's not a replication of your premenopausal bleed. It's just a withdrawal bleed in order to dump the lining of the uterus that was building up with the estradiol prior to the progesterone coming on board. So that doctor, no woman should be deciding for herself if her bleed is normal or not, because that might mean that she just decided to cycle progesterone without a doctor's oversight. You need to be working with your provider. They should be educating you on timing, expectations, duration, etc.
But most doctors aren't doing that. That's why they go to you.
Yeah. Well, the doctors we work with are.
Your doctors are very special. It's very hard to find these kind of doctors.
Yeah.
Really hard. And that's, we're talking about the US or even, Canada, but forget about Europe and the rest of the world. It's just even harder to find these kinds of doctors.
Yeah.
So,
trying to train more.
Yeah. And they're out there. They're just, let's be really honest that we have a medical industrial complex regulatory mechanism that definitely ties the hands of physicians from providing care in a way that they might see as the best option for women. And so sometimes some of these doctors have to sort of operate, a little bit outside of the system.
Yeah. You mentioned IUDs and heavy bleeding. So the woman who is considering a hysterectomy or an IUD because she is just bleeding like crazy, what advice do you have for her?
Well, make sure it's not a pathological problem first. I mean, make sure there's no.
Start with an ultrasound for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, understand, is there, polyps, is there fibroids, adenomyosis, what's at play? Is there excruciating pain involved? A lot of women don't realize that ferritin, stored iron, below, let's say, a level of 25, will actually cause a woman to have incredibly high cycles. And so some women, they think that the heavy cycles are causing them to be anemic, when in reality, they have this ferritin issue that's actually triggering the heavy bleed. And so again, this is where please don't work with these online femtech platforms. They're not measuring your ferritin. Any good doctor should be looking at, what is your iron status as a woman? What's your thyroid status? Like all these other things. But there can be non-uterine anomalies that trigger heavy bleeding. So that needs to be looked at as well. But then, rule that out, rule out uterine anomalies. And as Maria and I both learned, you can have all the imaging in the world, but a certain condition called adenomyosis does not come up on imaging for most women. And that can be the issue for some women. And so in those instances, you can say, I'm going to either not stimulate my uterus with any HRT, or I'm going to have a hysterectomy.
Fantastic. I've got like 25 more questions, but I'm going to have to let you girls go because this is so interesting. I got a lot of information and I learned so much from the Great Menopause Myth. And I think everyone needs to get this on their bookshelves. But you also have programs that train doctors as well and practitioners as well as just normal people like me. And everyone else is listening. So tell us a little bit more about anything in the book or any program. I think you have a retreat coming up, something, you got some other stuff going on.
We have a retreat coming up in March of 2025. We do have a mentorship for practitioners that could be anyone. We've had physicians. We tend to attract a ton of nurse practitioners, physical therapists, health coaches, nutritionists, dietitians. So that's our mentorship, and that we do twice a year. So in January and in April. And then we work with women, and that's not like something that's open and closed. They can just come to us at any time.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Yeah. Great. So they can find you on your website, which is wiseandwell.me, not .com, right?
Yeah. Right.
And go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say Instagram, really.
Yeah. And I was going to say quickly, Maria, we do have a new offering that we just debuted this month, which is a self-paced program. So we recognize that not all women have the budget to get one-on-one sessions with us and do all the functional testing and all of that stuff, but they really want sort of that A to Z that we provide from an educational standpoint. And we do now have a self-paced program that's a really low-cost budget option for women who just want to do that.
Cool. I'll have all of that in the show notes. Follow these girls on Instagram. They're always posting and it's always interesting. And I'm absolutely, grateful you guys are here. And I hope to have you on again.
I'd love it. Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.